What's up, gang? Thanks for joining the Undiplomatic Podcast, the show with undiplomatic takes about the foreign policy scene. I'm Van Jackson here with my co-host Julia Gledhill. What's good?
Everything's great. How are you, Van?
Do you have a cat with you?
Yes, I do. She's gonna make noises probably during this recording.
It's better than a barking dog. Yeah. So before we got on this, I saw a Financial Times report saying that Peter Navarro, who's Trump's favorite China hawk, like he served a bid in order as part of his refusal to like testify against Trump, basically. Like, so he is kind of ride or die, which is impressive, just for an evil purpose. But he wants to kick Canada out of Five Eyes, according to the Financial Times. And for people who don't know, Five Eyes is this sort of Cold War vestige intelligence sharing arrangement among the white rich countries, New Zealand, Australia, the US, Canada. It's super like bureaucratic, and like it was just intelligence sharing, you know? So like it never reached a sort of senior minister type level until the first Trump years. And then it got like very politicized as part of great power competition. And the Trump administration guys like Matt Pottinger wanted to use Five Eyes basically as like a political block against China, like BLOC. And that was very contested or controversial. And it's been kind of politicized ever since because its main focus is China. And other than Australia, most of the Five Eyes countries have tried to maintain a kind of sanity about like China threat inflation and like not tried to go down that path. But because you're in this like larger American web of shit, it's very hard to like maintain your own analysis and be 10 toes for America at all times. You know, like America kind of forces your hand. And so Five Eyes was one of the mechanisms by which we tried to create a kind of group think about China stuff. And that doesn't go over easy. The national security crowds in all these countries, I mean, they're here for it. But the politics of these countries, that makes it a very contested thing. So like even in New Zealand, it's like a pretty sort of divisive issue now, Five Eyes, whereas before it was just sort of under the radar during war on terror shit. Um,
Mm.
but yeah, the idea that like one of the eyes could be kicked out and it's down to four eyes or whatever, I don't know.
Yeah, unless Canada agrees to be our 51st state, presumably. That's the thought
So,
process.
so that's the weird contradiction here. Like either you let us annex you and you become part of America, or you can't be part of our intelligence sharing array. Like what?
Yeah, and we're gonna put what 25% tariffs on Canadian imports in March. That's like part of the whole plan,
It's
right?
coming.
Yeah.
Toward what
So
end? Other than the actual serious threat of annexation, what for what? You know?
I just like Trump sees American cultural prowess as kind of the foundation. It's just like, oh, like we've already seen the white supremacist march in Canada, so like might as well just make them part of the United States. I don't know. I don't know what the thought process is, but that's my inclination is to say that like um yeah, just like there's enough cultural overlap that he's like, whatever, you guys are basically Americans.
Just do it. Don't be pussies. Just do it. Like that's the like he's like goading them. Yeah. I mean, for what it's worth, Steve Bannon, he has from the jump, like from Trump 1.0, he has thought of Five Eyes as like basically the white nationalist bulwark. Like this is like if you're gonna do like the perfect white supremacist foreign policy, he had always wanted Five Eyes to be kind of the centerpiece of that. And that's like very rational from that point of view. Um, but that obviously goes against this Peter Navarro thing, like the idea that you would then kick them out. I think Steve Bannon even said, like, no, of course we want Canada to be in Five Eyes, you know.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
but other than the US, there's no like white nationalists have not taken over any governments in the Five Eyes. It's just the US. So like, so I don't know. Like, is that really I don't know. It doesn't look good to have like a white alliance, you know, in
No,
especially, yeah.
no. I didn't realize that about Bannon, but I mean, the other thing is just that like this idea of annexing Canada also not new. Like Pat Buchanan said, so much of what Trump spews to the public in the 90s. So I don't know. I think it's mostly distracting and designed to piss people off and make things more expensive. I don't know enough about Canadian domestic politics to say like what's
Imagine
going on, but
wanting to make
obviously,
things more expensive, you know,
yeah,
like what?
yeah. It's wild. It's wild. And it's like it's so funny because the United States is so blessed geographically and he loves to just like try to sabotage that in some way. Like I'm not worried necessarily about conflict with Canada, but like dude, like we've got two huge oceans and two friendly neighbors. Like why are you trying to mess this up?
That's the psychopath shit with some of the like old geopolitics thinking, which is like very much making a comeback now. Is like you're always in the old geopolitics logic, you're supposed to be creating like strategic buffer space, or like maybe you get defense in depth because you have more territorial space that has to be traversed before the enemy reaches you, or like that kind of twisted
Right.
logic shit. But what that literally always means is, and what it meant back then too, is that you have more territory that you have to worry about. If you stick an outpost way, way out where it can be like barely defended, you then have to worry about defending it. And then so like the mission creep of militarism is like this is why it's inevitably built in. If you try to like expand your territory for strategic reasons, there's no logical limit to that. It just keeps going. You make yourself less secure, you know?
Mhm. Yeah, and you take on a much more complicated and expensive task.
Yeah. And who benefits from that? So, um, in keeping with the I don't know, imperialist foreign policy thesis here, the big news on foreign policy this week seems to be the Ukraine minerals for military assistance deal. As of like 3 days ago, the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent went to Ukraine. He presented Zelensky with a surprise demand for half of Ukraine's mineral wealth, some of its oil and gas, its infrastructure, its ports, and it totaled up to being like a $500 billion bill that was presented. And it's supposed to
Mhm.
be because it's payback, you know, like we sent them so much military aid. And so Zelensky, like initially was caught off guard. He scoffed at it. I'm sure he was offended. But then also he was like, the total amount of aid that you provided was 69 billion, not 500 billion. So like you're overbilling
Right.
me, guys. And
Yeah.
so, but then Trump, I just saw on CNN, Trump announced that there is a deal in place now with Ukraine for minerals.
Yeah, it looks like the press secretary spoke about it today. It doesn't include the claim to $500 billion in profits generated by like mineral resources or other natural resources. But it's some kind of like jointly owned fund between the United States and Ukraine, where Ukraine would contribute 50% of the proceeds from, natural resources, like lithium. Still no security guarantees.
Mhm.
So I have not. I saw like a very brief article about it, but it seems like there's been some movement there. Um, who's to say? Who's to say if it's real? I give it a few more hours or days. At this point, I like to sit on things for like 48 hours before I take them terribly seriously, just because things move so quickly.
Yeah. Um, to some of the national security world bros that I sort of monitor at this point for like strategic warning purposes, they are, of course, like apoplectic about Trump and attacking the workforce that they find sacrosanct and all this stuff, and siding with Putin they find revolting, and like a lot of predictable stuff that makes them anti-Trump, and yet they are happy to sort of still be part of that machinery and serve the larger machinery. They have put forward two like bumper stickers for what they're basically trying to do within the Trump era as like the global paradigm. So these phrases are in circulation, and one is minerals for military assistance. So like an extractivist regime, like, primitive accumulation of natural resource extraction, like you would do in a colony. That's one pillar. That's what we're seeing in the Ukraine minerals deal, very straightforwardly. Um, and then the other is Monroe Doctrine to the shores of China, which, as a reminder, the Monroe Doctrine was an imperialist foreign policy doctrine, and it was exclusionary to other great powers, which it was the basis for like fucking dozens of wars that America launched and coups in Latin America. If that's what we're extending to the shores of China, we're it's World War III time. Like, also, I mean, also there will be lots of wars along the way, apparently, but like that's like nobody, not least China, is gonna like tolerate that, you know. Um, so that's scary shit. Also, it kind of contradicts some of the things Trump has been saying about China. So, like, you're gonna have Trump saying "la di da," I get along great with China, and that kind of shit. And then at the same time, you're gonna have the national security state designing this sort of death drive, on like trying to take advantage of the sort of rhetoric of imperialism or whatever to still be doing great power competition stuff. And it's like, God damn, this is not good.
Right, it's violence under the guise of competition and economic prosperity, and it it sort of undermines both of those goals, in decimating, uh, domestic economy and also the world when you try to sort of pursue this sort of expansionist, approach to foreign policy. I mean, it is like sort of what you say in the book around, the violence of the Cold War and like how we as a society, like Americans, don't learn enough about that, and so we don't see the risk of it being reproduced in current
Mhm.
foreign policy and can sort of buy into this idea of great power competition, which underwrites literally everything that's going on. Like, I mean, on the topic of the Pentagon and all the hullabaloo around cuts and realignments, like it's the same justification, the same argument structure. And it's so interesting because you see the Republican Party, led by folks like Roger Wicker on the Senate Armed Services Committee, who talk about peace through strength, who talk about another military buildup, and it's all to like combat communist China. And it's what's really struck, not to change topics too quickly, but what's really struck me about the Pentagon news in the past, couple of weeks has been the way that Republicans have been able to so effectively bandwagon with the likes of Doge and the Trump administration more broadly on the subject of cuts under, again, the sort of broader project of competing with China, when in fact these are the same advocates for massive increases in military spending. And I've been pretty disappointed with many in the Democratic Party because last week there was sort of a 2-day period where the Washington Post reported that the Trump administration, Hegseth, had basically ordered, a memo to be delivered, I think earlier this week, actually, to deliver 8% cuts of the annual Pentagon budget on, which would amount to $50 billion every year for the next 5 years. And you
It was
have,
very like misreported initially.
Yeah, I mean, it was like very confusing. And of course, it's a reshuffling of funds and not an actual deep Pentagon budget cut. But like the ranking member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Jack Reed, is, oh, yes, there's waste, yes, like da da da. But he and several other Democrats are saying, oh, like this would, pose a tragic and real threat to national security. And it's like, y'all, can you like just critically think about this for 2 minutes before you start talking about how deep Pentagon budget cuts threaten national security? Like, have you lost the plot completely? Have you not thought about this 5 moves down the road? Like, please.
Talk about owning the libs,
Oh my God. Like the fact that Roger Wicker is figuring out how to more effectively message on this, and he is literally the champion of military budget increases and so-called acquisition reform. Like, come on. And it is also, again, always under the umbrella of combating China.
Yeah, the China hawks and the military hawks on the Hill and in the Pentagon, they are proving to be extremely effective at like synthesizing whatever rhetoric emerges into their same fucking project to keep going forward with it on this trend line of death, and like it doesn't matter what words have to be integrated. what ideas you have to sort of attach this stuff to. They still figure out a fucking way to do it, Um,
Yeah,
super.
like we're gonna make a bunch of money out of Ukraine because we gave them all this military aid, la di da, and Biden's, defense of democracy, like all these things. And then it's like it's amazing. It's actually really impressive messaging wise when you have 2 weeks ago Trump saying he wants arms control talks with Russia and China. If he wanted to, he would. Suggested that like all three countries could have their military budgets in the future, saying there's no reason for us to build brand new nuclear weapons. And then the following week, nuclear modernization is exempted from this Hegseth memo from the defense secretary on outlining what an 8% annual budget cut would look like. Like,
Also,
wow, way
the
to own the
dude,
news cycle.
the dude who got nominated for Deputy Secretary of Defense, so the number two, I'm fucking blanking on his name, but Feinberg or something. But he said in his like submitted whatever the advanced testimony or whatever,
Testimony, yeah.
yeah, like he said the nuclear modernization project, which is the upper amount of it over 30 years is like untold, but like
1.7 trillion.
1.7, I've seen 1.9 trillion too, but at
Yeah,
that point who's counting? And
right.
that that, but like he said that project is super duper important for the Pentagon. Like that's one of his priorities, is to make sure that stays on track. Who is it for? Who's it for except fucking China? Like,
Yeah.
and in the old way of thinking about it in terms of great power, rough. So a buddy of mine who teaches at Georgetown, Dan Nexon, he has a kind of contrarian view of all of this. And I'm trying to think through it more because he makes some like serious points, but his basic argument is that like the Trump administration is not doing great power competition. And that strikes me as like insane to say, but I think that's true at like a grand strategy level. Like they're doing so much shit. They're doing white nationalist imperialism, and it just so happens that China competition stuff can like fall within that. But like when you look at everything, like where are the imperialisms happening? Panama Canal, fucking Greenland, fentanyl wars in Mexico. All of that is explicitly about China. All of it's justified in terms of China. So like if that's what the new shiny baubles are that draw our attention in foreign policy, well, there's no way to make sense of doing those things except as China rivalry. And that's how the advocates themselves are like framing it. So it's like they have a different theory for how to go about great power competition than say like Biden, who wanted to be like ruthlessly coherent about it and like all the ships moving in one direction. But like just because it's like less coherent or it's based on a different sort of theory of the case, different assumptions about world order or whatever, it's still happening. It's still like China centered. um yeah.
Yeah.
Fucking,
And it's China centered and it's like leaner, meaner primacy. Let's go.
mhm.
Which I think is like something that I thought was really funny in the Pentagon conversations around cuts was Senator Tuberville from Alabama bandwagoned with the Hegseth 8% cut memo. What did he say? He was like, I wouldn't be against them taking it from a Pentagon to a Trigon, cut a couple signs off. Like, yes, sir. Honestly, same. Like, I'm down. Let's do it.
Wow,
It's
I
just so
don't think I've ever heard that one
silly.
before. Yeah.
I know, right? Well, he's an entertaining senator, I will say that. Thank God likes are private on Twitter now because he used to like he used to like read out every tweet that like minority witnesses liked on their Twitter accounts, which is my personal nightmare. But yeah, I mean it's all China, it's all leaner, meaner war machine for the American people. And I mean, that's a pretty effective message.
Related to this like Pentagon topic, I haven't seen this get like any attention. And I think because like so much other shit is going on, but like the more we've talked about this before, the more strategically minded parts of like the arms control community, they've been agitating for a while to get rid of ICBMs. Like they're not needed. It's this push button nuclear holocaust weapon.
Yeah.
Once you launch, there's no ability to stop it. They're
Can't
super
take it back.
expensive to
Yeah.
maintain, right? So if we get rid of them, we can kind of improve strategic stability and cut costs. So it's like,
Mhm.
well, a very hawky retired admiral wrote a piece in the New York Post, which is like, you know, to the right of the New York Times by quite a bit.
Mhm.
And he made this was like 2 days ago. He made this very elaborate case to get rid of air launched nuclear deterrent capabilities. And the reason he was doing it was the Veep Cockthumb thing I wrote about. Like his goal is to save ICBMs and to avoid anyone looking closely at nuclear submarines because he's a retired admiral.
Right.
And so to do that, he lays out the argument for defunding LRSO, the long range standoff weapon. So
Yep.
this is the nuclear capable warhead that the B-52 and the B-21 can deliver. So that's
Mhm.
the air nuclear deterrent piece, right?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
a bunch of national security bros. I mean, the reason I found out about this is because I'm monitoring them, monitoring him, or they're monitoring any changes to the discourse. Like, God forbid somebody change anything about national security. And so, like, I'm watching them, watching for those changes. And so they started clapping back at him at this op ed saying, like, actually, we need to fund one less Columbia class submarine. Right. That would save hundreds of millions of dollars. We need to get
Mhm.
rid of the sea-launched nuclear cruise missile, which the Navy says it doesn't even fucking want, right? And
Yeah.
so if you add up all, do you realize what's happening here? If you add up all these arguments that they're making, they're exposing the false god of nuclear deterrence. Like
Yeah.
they're each making the case for why other parts of the nuclear triad are bullshit. And so it's like
Yeah.
they're
I mean, we
giving
talked
us
about this recently as well, where like, I mean, the establishment of the triad itself is a product of inter-service rivalry. And
yes.
it goes back actually to the establishment of DoD and the unification of the armed services after World War II. If I recall correctly, it was Secretary Forrestal of the Navy who, during the sort of debates over whether and how to unify the armed services, raised sort of the question of um, civilian control of the military and also the like militarization of foreign policy. If you had the establishment of the Air Force and all these other things also in the National Security Act of 1947, CIA, National Security Council, all of these sort of new entities within the sort of military establishment. And to be fair, at the time, the Navy opposed unification of the armed services because it was privileged previously and, didn't like sort of want to fight.
The Navy
Um,
controlled a bunch of like foreign territory. I mean, like it was its own
yeah,
empire. Yeah.
yeah, and, like, they didn't want things to change, but, I mean, one of the point of this is that, like, one of the critical arguments against unification of the armed services was the ability of special interests to corrupt, defense policy and foreign policy writ large, and also sort of the, how that manifests in inter-service rivalry, which, like, I think really shines through today when you have debates like this, and also just like the sort of obsession with technological superiority and nuclear superiority
Mhm.
specifically. My colleagues at the Stimson Center actually published a paper um, earlier this week, called Gambling on Armageddon, that I'd really recommend folks read if you're interested in sort of like the history of the establishment of the triad, sort of like deterrence, and deterrence theory, where it's brought us today. And this idea of sort of technological superiority and our sort of preoccupation with that has led us down many faulty, dangerous, expensive paths. The B-21 is one of them in addition to the ICBM.
Mhm.
It goes back to like, Roosevelt being really afraid of like air power, and air power in Nazi Germany. And like, it's just the history of air power and sort of how that's manifested. And the idea of like sort of strategic bombing now is wild. Yeah, I think that that's a much harder argument to make to get rid of the like B-21 than the ICBM, but I'm for it personally.
Yeah, keep sending in your arguments, folks, about why we need to cut different weapon systems.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, but like the nuclear triad was not like you say, and this is the history. I guess it's in this report, but it was also in there's a classic book called Wizards of Armageddon by Fred Kaplan, and he
Yeah.
covers this too. But it's like the nuclear triad was not this wholly strategic concept, like we backed our way into it from like the reality of bureaucratic politics basically, and
Mhm.
then we fetishized it. Then people who make their living staring at penis shaped weapons started developing like these sacrosanct ideas around it and everything, but like it
Yeah.
just ain't so, like it's very happenstance that we even like came to these ideas in the first place. um
Right, and the political constituencies in those states too are critical to their
mhm,
permanence, their
mhm.
lasting power. Like, it's North Dakota, it's Wyoming, like, it's gonna be really hard for those lawmakers to, lobby against or, oppose more ICBM funding, the Sentinel, despite, uh, I think it's 81% cost growth since 2020, so and just like obviously they're very dangerous, but we are literally like mortgaging our futures on this shit.
They don't, yeah, like if you live near an ICBM silo in the Midwest, like you do realize if we end up in a nuclear exchange, you're the first strategic targets. Like you're
Yeah.
gone,
Yeah.
and it's because they're fixed sites. Like
Mhm.
it's easiest to plan against if you're America's enemy, and it's like nobody makes that case in these areas because I don't know, like maybe they don't know this, but like it's also
They're
maybe like
underground, who cares?
yeah, yeah, like and like you've lived with them for so long, you don't take the actual risk seriously,
Yeah, totally.
which is
Um, Everybody should read Nuclear War by Annie Jacobsen. It's one of the, like, only fast-paced, like, sort of easy reads on what a nuclear scenario would look like. Highly recommend, and it made me think critically about where I live in DC. I was, like, Googling my mileage from the Pentagon and the Capitol, and I'm firmly in the zone where I would be burned alive and then, slowly die. So,
the
I
ideal is
unfortunately, I'm not in the incineration zone. I wouldn't just be immediately dust. I would burn, and then die slowly. So,
yeah. At
yeah.
some point that should affect real estate prices. Like if you're in the mid zone, that you shouldn't be able to get insurance and like that kind of thing. Uh, yeah.
Oh, that's grim. That's so grim. I
Actually,
have looked up like nuclear, where's the best place to like go? You nowhere to go. The metro, just you're gonna be in like a sardine box with a bunch of other people. Um, Unlike Switzerland, apparently Switzerland has like every building, I think to this day. Did this come up last time we talked about nuclear weapons? They have nuclear bunkers are like required uh
I
in
didn't know
like
this.
new builds in Switzerland. I could be totally wrong, but that was the case at one point that there are like many nuclear bunkers throughout the
Wow.
country. So yeah, they were super concerned.
If culture is downstream of politics, there's a show on Disney Plus called Paradise that's like just out right now. And it starts out as this murder mystery with a guy who's like the Secret Service presidential detail or whatever for POTUS. But then you realize that the guy who's POTUS, who's a dipshit who played Cyclops in X-Men, he's like a very handsome dummy. And like he's no longer POTUS, he's ex-POTUS, but this Secret Service guy is still his body man, like guarding him. And then and then he gets killed. But what gets unveiled is that this very idyllic town that they live in, where he's in retirement in his mansion and everything, because he's former POTUS, it's actually a created town deep inside mountains in Denver or some shit, and the world has been destroyed. And there's only 25,000 people left in the world. And so there's a murder mystery going down in that alternative universe. And like if culture is downstream of politics, then like the imagination is going toward this world where it's like we're not trying to stop the apocalyptic thing. We're trying to think how to optimize for the apocalyptic thing so that we can sort of like have our best shot afterward.
People are definitely building bunkers and stuff. I don't know if they're necessarily designed for a nuclear scenario, but if anybody's doing it, it's like the Kardashians or something. They already have like I think no, maybe it was Kanye, I think had like like a Western town that he built in like Colorado or something just to like put on cowboy boots and like fuck around
I have not
essentially.
heard this.
Yeah, it's I don't know. He's up to weird stuff. He like owns so much of Wyoming and like he's running schools there. I don't know. I don't know. Everything I've learned about him is against my will. So
There was a time, you might have been too young for it, but like he was the man, you know? Like there was nobody who was like a bigger genius, and now he's
yeah.
a psycho Nazi something. It's troubling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember graduation, but honestly, I was just like never really that into him, to be honest. I had the
Anyways,
foresight. I had my instincts proved me correct.
I miss the old Kanye. Um, yeah, the one other thing on the Pentagon cuts or the Pentagon news,
Shuffling
like
of funds.
yeah,
So we can
yeah.
have Iron
I
Dome
know.
for
We have to
America.
talk about this consistent with like consistent rhetoric. There was a story in Politico that said like Trump is now gonna he has said that he'll fire senior military leaders for having followed his predecessor's lawful orders, and
Mhm.
so and then of course there's all this purge going on of the JAGs and everything. It's just clear that like there's many ways you can narrate this, but one thing that's definitely happening is that they want the military instrument to be free from accountability. And so they're consolidating like a mindless loyalty in the military tool, but they're losing the ability to use that tool rationally because they're stripping it for parts, intellectually and stuff. But also to like they're losing the ability to like make that tool accountable to law. And so that's worrying from a, doing wars everywhere perspective, but it's also worrying in terms of like turning the military against its own people. Like one condition of possibility to do that is to strip out accountability. So I don't know. It's not great.
No, no, it isn't. Yeah, it's like gut the federal government and call it efficiency. Um, I like Doge is going. What's interesting is that there's like parallel efforts happening. There's Doge that says that it's making its way to the Pentagon, which it was in absolutely no rush to do. Of course, they're immediately going after like probationary employees. And then it's like within a matter of days, Hegseth orders like what, an 8% cut on the annual budget every 5 years for the next 5 years would look like. And then says, oh, it's really just so we can shift toward whatever, Iron Dome for America, nuclear modernization, the border, all of those things. And so it's like it's difficult to follow, but I think like all of it is in service of not only gutting the Pentagon, like physically of people and things, but like gutting the regulatory process for the way that we acquire weapons. I've already ranted about this on here, so I'll like refrain from doing so again. But you know, it's like this is how Republicans who support military budget increases are bandwagoning with the acquisition reformers within industry, which
Mhm.
don't discriminate between primes and Silicon Valley, for example. Like that's something that they're actually all on board together on. And it's interesting because it's like, you have Palantir or whatever that beat up on the primes repeatedly. And they say they don't do their own research and development. They don't do their own investment. They're not innovating. And they talk about monopsony. So does Wicker. Like they sort of cherry pick all of these things that are indeed true, and then turn them around to say, give it all to us, deregulate everything, and you have to get rid of the people first before you can sort of get rid of the regulatory structure. And Congress is susceptible to jumping on board with that for the reasons that they always do, which is, oh, these are the national security experts, or like because the brass are on board or whatever, so that they again can get bigger budgets for their services. Like it all goes back to careerism, to inter-service rivalry, the way that people are bought out by special interests. And it's all in service of, again, like competing with China. And it's like, Palantir, the CTO Sankar, like he says it's not necessarily about like efficiency. It's about mass production. It's about literally ramping up arms production.
And he
He
said we're
talks
at
about
war
like
with China.
But this war started long ago. It was an economic war with the ascension of China to the World Trade Organization, the greatest IP theft in history, the greatest wealth transfer in history. It is an opium war. The number one cause of deaths of 18 to 45-year-olds in this country is fentanyl. That is coming from China. It is a diplomatic war. The Belt and Road Initiative is basically indentured servitude for other countries to the CCP here. And the unprecedented phase zero gray zone operations of the CCP, how many times are we going to believe that anchors are dragged across the sea to cut undersea cables here? But I think one of the things, China knows they're at war. The question is, we kind of equivocate on it as a peace-loving nation.
He's literally saying, he's like, this is happening now, and so we are part of that fight, so give us money. Like, that's their
Yeah.
business model. It's war with China
Yeah.
business model.
Yeah, and he published his theses, like his treatise on the defense reformation, likened Palantir and himself, I guess, to Martin Luther, and like he published his paper in the fall. Did you see this? It's wild.
No, I need to
It's
find. I'm writing a book that's adjacent to all of this, so like I need
Yeah.
to look it up.
Wait, you're writing another book already?
Yeah.
Van, where do you
You'll
find the
you'll actually
time?
you'll really like this book, and it's going to be a slower burn. Like, I'm not going to do it in 6 months or whatever, but yeah, it's a
Okay.
longer project.
Um, okay, I have to ask you about your work process another time, but yeah, so like, I
Does
mean,
he use the
Sankar,
phrase defense reformation?
it's titled The Defense
God
Reformation. He
dang.
explicitly references Martin Luther. Like, could not
It's too
be
perfect. It's like in the worst way. Um okay,
just the
Jesus.
tone. It is so self-indulgent. Um, Yeah, you have to read it immediately. I've been reading it. I mean, he published it in the fall and then he testified last month. Testimode
I like
shorthand, I guess.
testimode actually. Testimode.
Testimode. And included all of these same points, but it all goes back to like mass production. He talks about how during World War II, commercial firms like General Mills, like Ford, turned on a heel and started, working for the war effort, like did industrial production for World War II and then, stopped. Ford tried really hard to get into aircrafts and like wasn't very successful, and ended up like, going back to the auto industry. But it's so interesting because Palantir talks about like mass production and over efficiency and like, commercial firms did it then, we can do it now. And it's like, dude, it was World War II and we were spending an incredible amount of money to make that happen. And by
And it
the
wasn't
end,
hard for them to pivot. Like, they turned on production very fast enough to win the war, if I recall. And so, like, what's the wrong with that? Why do you have to do it before war? Like, why do you have to do this indefinitely as if the war is here already?
yeah, I mean, it's an interesting history of like the mobilization part because by the end it was like very fraught. There was like a lot of labor strikes. From what I understand, like a lot of the actual facilities ended up like coming under government control. Like there was all sorts of issues with that. And then like of course in the like sort of beginning of the post-war era, like immediately Cold War transition and the industry like changed a lot. But it's because we spent a shit ton of money, and critically that had a depressive effect on long-term productivity. Like I'm not saying like whatever we shouldn't have mobilized for World War II necessarily, but like we did that because it was World War II and it had long-term detrimental economic impacts on the country that Palantir doesn't care about, because they're the best ever and the most innovative and the smartest and whatever.
Well, it was pretty depressing for the labor movement long term, which is kind of the original sin of why America is so fucked up now. But yeah, I mean, I think we've both said this at different points, but like taking the profits out of war would go a long way toward, curing what ails us here.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, it's like it's so interesting. I can't remember if I said this last time, but what the National Security Advisor Waltz said recently that, oh, like the submarine industrial base or subs in general like are sort of a ripe area for cuts because we're spending so much and getting so little. That's also one of the exemptions in Higgs's memo on, reshuffling of funds. We're not going to spend less on that. So there's a lot of sort of contradiction within the administration, and like I think that they know exactly what they're doing. Like they are smart enough to know what's actually going on, and they literally do not care, which of course is unsurprising. But um, yeah, like I have nothing else to say about it. It's just
If
really
they
good.
if they respond rationally to this sort of totality of militarist interest groups, special interest, what's going to end up happening, the most likely path where we're at 12 months from now or 2 years from now, is that the new defense industry cartel guys, the Palantirs and SpaceXs and everything, they may or may not take a greater share of the overall defense budget, but the way that their stock bottom line goes up is if they get overall more money so than they're
Yeah.
getting now. So like, and
Well,
what does that mean? That just means increasing the defense budget so that the pie is big enough to pay all the old primes plus all the defense
yeah.
industry
Yeah.
cartels. It's like
Everything
the
and more.
worst of
Yes,
all
and.
worlds.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, it's not going to be a trade-off at all. And critically, Project Maven, like the Titan, like these sort of big contracts that Palantir has, for example, obviously they're, AI data analytic company. Um, the reason they're on board with the primes for acquisition reform and gutting weapon acquisition is because the whole narrative is, oh, we're in a technological era. We need to move past the industrial life cycle phases of weapon development. And so we need to get rid of like milestone decisions and like whatever, like all the sort of guardrails in the
Yeah,
acquisition
yeah.
process. That's perfect for software that is never finished ever. And you can't test it really either. So you can just sort of keep it's like a ice cream cone that never ends, or like a lollipop that how many licks to the center, infinity, literally infinity.
If you step back and look at all this shit, it's like accelerationism. Like, what if you wanted to just accelerate a global empire's decline, you know, in even at the expense of like having World War III happen, like how would you do it? Well, you'd go around smashing alliances, smashing their hegemonic architecture in the form of all these multilateral institutions, and then you do trillion-dollar defense budgets and then be like, that's not enough. We need more. And then like find new reasons based on the fucking threat mongering. And like and then all the while it's like $4.5 trillion in tax cuts, the fucking gutting food stamps. It's like, let's destroy higher education so we can't have another woke middle class, which is to say no middle class at all.
Yeah.
This is this is fun. All right. Um, Slightly tangent, next topic, whatever. um, Non-aligned Europe. Okay, so Germany, the incoming chancellor, Spain, they've all said like, we need to be able to start making foreign policy decisions independent of the US. We need to be basically non-aligned. And then we've got like anonymous EU diplomats literally saying that America is Europe's adversary now and for the foreseeable future. So strategically, this is a huge, huge vibe shift, huge alignment shift, huge shift in like the narratives that are in the back of our head as we look at policy stuff, profound. And then I have this like 30-second clip from Trump that I just saw today.
But I love the countries of Europe. I love all countries, frankly, all different. But the European Union's it was formed in order to screw the United States. I mean,
What about the
let's be
other
honest.
countries, bro?
The European Union was formed in order to screw the United States. That's the purpose of it.
He said it
They did a good
twice.
job of it, but now I'm president.
What will happen if these countries where the EU retaliate?
They can't. I mean,
The European Union was formed to screw the United States. And just in case you thought that was an errant comment, let me repeat myself. And then this was he announced 25% tariffs on the EU, on your EU countries in conjunction with that statement, right? That was like his rationale.
Oh my God. Is Trump an only child? Does he have siblings?
Yeah, doesn't he have like a sister named Mary Trump who hates him?
It's very possible. He just gives such only kid energy.
Yeah,
Like
he does.
how? Like how is he so self-involved? Like he's got next level brain rot.
Good thing he's only the president of the United States. Yeah.
I do think I do get the sense he's getting tired though. Like I feel like that's why he has all of these like puppets now, because he just like um I'm still not convinced that he like even really wanted this job. It's like now that he has
No.
it, he's just like doing whatever. But I think it was more about winning than it was about like governing or like sort of continuing to like be the face. Like he sort of established himself to the point that it doesn't matter if he's like on our feeds all the time. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. But so funny, so funny.
That's a wild statement about the EU. And I mean, it's very funny, but also like it just reinforces like this this new emerging European posture of non-alignment, which I was on the Left Reckoning podcast like yesterday, and we talked about this too. Like the world needed Europe to have this energy like a decade ago. I mean,
Yeah.
like this is the only bulwark against a sort of, a hegemonic psychopath or like a hegemon that's also fascistic. The only sort of safeguard that the world can have against that is to sort of de-align or be non-aligned relative to it, you know. But the contradiction or like the irony even in that, which is like this is something I've argued many places, but like even in doing that, there's a huge risk that like you're still accelerating the kind of world that Trump is accelerating. And so there's a way in which all of this feels overdetermined because it's like what they're building toward and what they would be perfectly happy to have, the MAGA intellectual types, is a multipolar world where we all consolidate into nation states that are implicitly ethnically homogenous in their preferred view. And then they clash around like billiard balls in the international system. And the way that you look out for yours best is by having concentrated more power at the expense of others. So in that kind of world, it's like primacy for me, multipolarity for thee. It's like
Mm.
we can have the fewest checks on our power and the greatest free reign to just butt fuck Mother Earth and take over fucking whatever we need to and do primitive accumulation. That is easiest in a multipolar world where everybody relies on only themselves. And then we can be the most predatory there, you know? So it feels like we're heading toward that no matter what we do, and like Trump is a force for that in a way that kind of seems to make it go faster. But like this non-alignment thing is definitely happening. Like this is a meta trend, so
Yeah. Well, it just forces everyone to figure out like what exactly their vision is, and you have to like offer sort of a more like a positive alternative like for yourself, for your region, in a way that I don't think we've necessarily seen. Not a Europe expert, but yeah, that's sort of the way I see it, is that it's just like expediting everything, which there's like maybe a silver lining there, but it is, to your point, detrimental when we don't have sort of a collective vision of like what a new era in global politics looks like under multipolarity.
narratives
And
needed is very much what's going on right now. Like we need,
yeah,
yeah, because I mean, one thing I think Dan Nexon is right about is that like it, to the extent that you view great power competition as like necessary or desirable, which
mhm,
is very much the project of like national security elites in the West, right?
yep,
And like if that's your frame of mind, that narrative is fucked 15 different ways. And so like America is still doing great power competition, but that's not a good thing. And if you were a country that found like, a psychic wage in doing great power competition because it rallied America to your side or some shit like that, that calculation's totally fucked. That story is super rat fucked. So like if you're the EU now, think about it. You have spent the last 7-8 years hyping the China threat,
yeah,
systemic rival and shit. Well, guess
yeah.
what? China and the US are the two greatest powers in the world system. Are you having them both be adversaries of you? You can't, you have fucked up, like so they need to like readjust their calculations about China as part of a kind of non-alignment, like I don't know. This is all the everything shifting.
Yeah, look to the middle powers, play the field.
Yeah, yeah, something. This is not a topic to be discussed necessarily, but I saw a random thing that said that the median age of home buyers in the US is 56 years old. This is not geopolitics, although in a way it's downstream of geopolitics. That's quite old. I mean, that's like, I
And it's
think
up a
boomers.
lot from, I think the article said what, like 46 in like 2021? Like it's up a lot. Or
That
47.
yeah. So it's like I already knew that as a millennial and certainly as Gen Z, like you're kind of fucked. You know, like especially if you had built a career in the federal workforce. And so like you probably chances are if you're the average younger gen person, you cannot afford a home. Um, and this like I hadn't seen numbers that suggest who is affording homes, who is buying homes. And like that's old as fuck. 56?
Yeah.
Everyone below
Mhm.
56 is unlikely to be getting a home. That's crazy. That's a busted economy.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's extremely depressing. I'd love to see like, the just like the discourse that of around like sexual politics and like the kind of extension of adolescence, which people love to talk about when shitting on Gen Z and even millennials. It's like people can't like the markers of growing up are no longer accessible. So yeah, like you might be 33 and have 5 roommates. Like, that's, like, not weird. Or 5, that's a lot, but, like, a few roommates. It's not weird. It's
Yeah.
just life.
And that's a totally different mode of living from the generation
Yes.
above you, you know?
Where
Totally
you're,
different.
couple of kids in a house by, like, 30. Yeah.
Yeah. There's actually this is a slight tangent, but I feel like this is so I captured something really well that I just want to read out this quote that I found. There's a journalist named Liz Plank who has a
Mhm.
very interesting Substack, and she brands herself as a feminist who loves men. A piece out like yesterday. Okay, millennials haven't become more conservative with age. Decades of political science research showing that people naturally drifted rightward as they got older, that financial stability and home ownership and family building would inevitably transform the youth vote into the Republican base. But millennials never got the financial stability. We never got the home ownership. And we
Yeah.
watched institutions fail us so thoroughly that we have remained, on the whole, progressive. This makes us a generation that has not shifted rightward. And maybe that's why, because we've watched neoliberalism fail in real time, despite
Mhm.
everything we've lost, we refuse to lose our belief that things can change for the better. If anything, we've radicalized. We realized we were raised on hope and change. And unlike the generations before us, we never stopped believing that progress isn't just possible, it's necessary.
Mhm.
And that plus the Iraq War, I mean, that's pretty much it. Like,
Yeah. I mean,
yeah,
yeah, totally. Like, nothing radicalizes like, crazy student debt, war, and not being able to buy a house, and then being, like, just shit on, incessantly as, like, the cringe generation.
yeah.
Um, yeah, no, it's totally true. And, like, there was, like, the millennial bashing, like, is also, like, in my view, what I've seen of it is very much like, "Oh, like, they won't grow up." And I actually think that there's, like, a workforce issue here too, where, like, you don't have, traditional markers of adulthood, and it's also really hard to make it to, like, the middle, like, I don't wanna say middle management necessary, but sort of like mid-range, like career positions, like especially in sort of my field and like nonprofit world in DC. Obviously not the case everywhere, but like there's like early career and then there's like you're well into your 40s and 50s, you direct a program. Like the middle
There's a big
range is like
gap. There's a ceiling.
there's a
Yeah.
huge gap. And I don't think it's just like this industry. I think it's probably more prevalent than that. So it's like you don't get the career opportunity and you don't get the traditional like things that you might achieve in like sort of middle adulthood or like, by the time you're 30, you're like a 12-year-old adult essentially. And, people expect to like or traditionally people had things like a house by then. So
People used to have things. Yeah.
people used to have things, it turns out.
Jesus. Yeah. Well, one area where that might be a growth sector is being a mercenary for empire, So
Mhm.
the final quick story here, the Blackwater infamy CEO. People may not even know about Blackwater anymore. In the Bush years, that was like the most scandalous, evil shit ever. Um,
Yeah.
but basically, private defense contractor Erik Prince, he had been the CEO of that. He's close to the Trump administration. He goes to the national conservative conferences and shit. He pitched the Trump White House, this is in Politico, on a proposal to carry out mass deportations through a network of processing camps on military bases, through a private fleet of 100 planes, and an army of private citizens empowered to make arrests, which is something we referred to in our previous episode together. It's a 26-page document that Politico got. The price tag on this fucking nightmare is $25 billion. And the metric of success he's trying to hit for that price tag of lawlessness is to deport 12 million people before the 2026 midterms. You can't make this shit up. I mean, that's like out of a fucking, like a novel.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty dystopic. We also, I mean, it's just the stories around like private industry carrying out Trump's vision of the next 2 years that I've seen stories about moving incarcerated people in the United States to like, Central America. It's absolutely wild. And it's definitely sort of an extension of like, yeah, war on terror, contractor creep. And it's wild that like I just expect there to be more pushback, and maybe I'm just not seeing it, but like, my experience with veterans who went to Iraq or Afghanistan has been very much like, oh, these contractors were twiddling their thumbs in their air conditioned, like
Mhm.
whatever tents, and we're out here like eating mush and like, how has
Yeah.
that not been more damaging to the likes of Blackwater and otherwise? I don't know.
Yeah, no. When I was on the Left Reckoning podcast yesterday, one of the questions they had is like, the military is getting fucked over left and right here. And like people who actually believe in national security as like an ideology, like they are under assault in all the ways by the Trump administration. And so it's like, are they going to push back? Are we going to have the military sort of like resist or revolt or anything like that? And people are like praying yes, but like I don't see it. I don't see how like they're trained to obey lawful orders. They don't know what to do when it comes to politics. They never recognized that their own ideology had politics built in from the start, like, and they don't have an alternative narrative to grasp onto beyond whatever narratives they were clinging to before that justified great power competition and shit. So like I they're I don't know. Pity the national security wonk, I guess. I don't know what to say, but it's bleak. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
it's super bleak. People ask me all the time, like, how the government became so dependent on contracting for like literally everything, not just like, uh, war on terror, like literal war activities, but like also, as we've discussed, like admin at the
admin, yeah,
Pentagon,
it's like
like IT, just literally everything. And this sort of like rise of the consulting class, like it's been, I don't know, like, I think it goes back to, um, like, sort of financialization in, like, the '70s, and, like, just the idea of, like, companies sort of consolidating by buying up. I mean, the defense industry did this too, they traditionally, the primes, like, bought up, um, smaller companies and were able to, like, sort of dress up their books and expand capacity in like a really superficial way. And I think probably that had something to do with sort of the rise of consulting. But no, it's pervasive and very insidious.
yeah, it's financialization in an economy that had been kind of built around the idea of military Keynesianism. Like there's a deliberate attempt by Congress to sort of have the economy sort of rely on national security spending. And that's the context within which like neoliberalism sort of happens. Um,
Yeah. And it's
yeah,
really frustrating because it's such an inefficient way to go about doing this. Like, I mean, you and Mike talk about like national security Keynesianism in the book
yeah,
and sort of distinguish it in some way from military Keynesianism. But like, um, like going back to sort of the China sort of narrative around literally everything that we're talking about, to kind of wrap it up a little bit. It's like the best way to go about navigating the future as the United States is very much to focus on rejuvenating like democracy, the economy, and moving away from like the sort of military or national security Keynesianism, whatever you want to call it, because like you can stimulate the economy in like such better and more inclusive ways. Like, key on the inclusive part. It's like
Yeah.
gifted era level shit out here, and it's not good. It's not good. I don't know how my generation is gonna evolve, whether we'll sort of follow the millennial path and like move left. I don't know. I think that's sort of the criticisms of like Zoomers like moving right on cultural issues, because like Zoomers can't read and like aren't educated. I'm trying not to be too nihilistic about that.
Well, I know
Cool.
avocado
We'll
toast is
down a
going to
little
be,
bit.
you're going to be priced out of avocado toast with all these tariffs.
No.
So.
Oh man.
All right. Well, maybe.
No, the Zoomers are actually, their downfall is going to be that they were like vaping in like middle school. So maybe we'll die too soon before like anybody even wants to buy a house. Sorry, that's kind of grim.
Yeah.
We can cut that out.
All right. Well, feeling good as usual.
Yeah,
okay.
Great note to end on.
Yeah. Well, Undiplomatic Podcast, baby. Like and subscribe, folks. Thanks.
Peace out.
Good to see you.